I'm going to give a very brief background, and then I'm going to hand over to Maxime Frerk, who's the main author of the final report. And then we're really fortunate that our colleagues who've been closely involved with the PIAG project are going to respond on the report. We're then going to have a discussion. So on to the next slide, Nikki, please. So a really brief background for colleagues who haven't been closely involved with the process. So first of all, going back really quite a number of years, a number of us saw that GB smart meter data was really a potential source of accurate and fine-grained energy demand side data. Second, really important on data access, the decision under the GB's own privacy rules sits with the consumer. Generally, we support that. And also, and I think it's really important, and it's a bit of a common misunderstanding, there is no central GB hub of smart meter data. And the paper you'll find on international comparisons will show that that really isn't quite like other places, other jurisdictions. So our aim with the PIAG project has been to build recognition of the public interest value of the data, to demonstrate the additionality that smart meter data could bring, and that's for different public interest uses, and it's for different public interest actors. And then also, given the sensitivities, we wanted to show how data access could work securely. And we also very much wanted to build a stronger evidence base for BEIS, for Ofgem, for decision makers. So next slide, please. So this has been our approach. It's actually been a 3-year process. It's been very systematic and it's been highly iterative. We set up right at the outset the Public Interest Advisory Group, and we had sponsors and relevant members consistently at the table with us. We produced a phase 1 report in July 2019, almost 2 years ago now, and a series of background papers. We have a dedicated microsite, which if you haven't taken a look, it really is a very major resource. It has all our publications there, and we really hope that anyone thinking in future about working in this space, taking forward policy in this space, will actually start by clicking onto our PIAG library. So what were the findings from phase 1? Well, unequivocal finding number 1 is that GB really has a clear need for better demand side data, be that national, regional, or local. And we concluded that government and policymakers and the regulators, they really risk, we call it flying blind into the transition unless they secure access to better demand side data. Remember, there's no central GB smart meter hub. We also concluded that it's feasible to balance public interest aims with privacy concerns, and there are ways tested and tried to anonymize and aggregate data, including smart meter data, and one can look across to approaches in other sectors. Our Office of National Statistics got new powers under the Digital Economy Act 2017 to take on that kind of trusted processor role. So our proposed way forward was we need a trusted processor who can govern access to smart meter data. For the short term, and we were very pragmatic in our conclusions, we want government to make better use of supplier data. So if you like, continue as now, but more so, frankly, considerably more so. And then longer term, we identified that there may well be other suitable routes to access smart meter data, and that's all in the phase 1 papers where we look at those issues. So PIAG 2, this is who's involved, and you can see here our funding partners. I should add Sustainability First and Centre for Sustainable Energy. For those of you who don't know us, we are charities. Our funding partners for phase 2 are here: Catapult, Smart DCC, Electrolink, Elexon, and the Greater London Authority. Our phase 1 funders, for whom we're also very grateful, included Ofgem, the UCL Smart Energy Research Lab, National Grid, and Northern Power Grid. So we've had a lot of people involved funding the project and also at the table. And I just would like to take this opportunity really to thank everybody for their support in helping us get this off the ground and steer it through. Okay, so last slide from me. What did we do in the second phase? So we started last January, and we took a really focused and in-depth look at the added benefit that smart meter data could potentially bring. Firstly, to the government's official energy statistics and data. Secondly, to regulation, and in particularly to regulatory evaluations and assessments. Thirdly, very important, local energy planning. And fourth, heat analytics. What more could one do on analysis of low carbon heat with better demand side data? And we've pulled together the final report. We put it out there in May. As I said, Maxime Frerk from Sustainability First is our main author. But we also tried with PIAG Phase 2 to keep the topic of smart meter data for a public interest purpose, to keep it live. And we tracked progress on where we were from our first round recommendations. Our workshops have proved a really valuable information exchange. It isn't, in a sense, this group doesn't get together anywhere else, certainly at the moment. And we also continue to provide, we hope, thought leadership and work as an independent and trusted convener. So we think we've done all these things in phase 2. I hope I've given a good and quick sketch of what we've done, why we've done it, and how we've done it. So now I'm going to hand over to Maxine on the final report, just as a helicopter is very loudly whirring overhead. So Maxine, thank you.
Thank you, Judith. So go on to the next slide, Nikki. So, an overview of what we're covering today. Judith's already taken us through the work in phase 1, where we looked at a high level at the use cases and explored the privacy angles and almost the technical routes to data, but out of that felt that more evidence was needed to support the case for really opening up smart meter data in the way that we envisaged. I think, since that first phase, the policy context has continued to evolve and really raised yet further the importance of this agenda, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And then the process that we followed in phase 2, as Judith said, we had these 4 workshops, and again I will talk through in a bit more detail what we got out of each of those workshops and how they really showed the clear additional value that smart meter data could provide. And then out of all of that, we came up with 6 recommendations, broad themes and recommendations about practical actions that would allow us to take this forward, as well as focusing on the kind of vision that we had presented in phase 1 about those routes to data in the longer term. So next slide. So talked about the evolving data policy context. I think it's right to say that data is becoming increasingly important across all sectors. Since phase 1, we've had the UK National Data Strategy published, but as well, energy data has been a real focus of attention. Energy Data Task Force produced their first report at about the same time as we produced our PIAG first report, and an awful lot has happened off the back of that, with what was the Modernising Energy Data Programme now being rechristened as modernising energy digitalisation. And as Judith mentioned, we're very lucky to have Phase to talk a little bit further about their thinking on energy data and digitalisation at the end of today. We've had the net zero statutory target introduced since PIAG kicked off, and that really highlights the importance of getting better data to enable us to set the policies that we need to hit net zero. As a part of that, we've had a focus, a lot of local authorities and cities declaring local climate emergencies, and out of that, a real focus on local area energy planning. And again, we want to look at the data that you need to do that. We've had COVID-19 and a levelling up agenda. And again, I think COVID-19 has shown us the real value that data has in being able to track in real time what's happening on the ground and evaluate how initiatives are impacting and in different groups of society. We've had a lot of developments in AI and machine learning at a technical level, but also at a policy level. And even in the last week, a report put out by government looking at innovation and regulatory reform that's needed has highlighted potential changes that are needed to really push the AI opportunities, and also flagging potential changes to the privacy landscape, as Brexit means we may not need to follow quite the letter of GDPR, and we can make sure that what we have going forward allows us to maintain important privacy protections, but to get the opportunities and take advantage of opportunities. So the PIAG work sits in the context of this agenda, which, as I say, has really only strengthened the case for doing the kinds of things that we've been looking at. So next slide. Going back now through each of those workshops. First workshop was on Phase statistics. And we spent quite a bit of time really getting our heads around the data that's already out there so that we could be clear what the added value would be from smart meter data. We had a particular focus on two data sources, the subnational energy statistics, which is what gives you a picture of data at a kind of lower super output area, a really kind of granular geographic picture. And the Need database, which is an anonymised database, 4 million individual household records linked to the energy efficiency performance of the buildings that those people live in. But both of those data sets are reliant on the same data source, which is an annualized and therefore effectively estimated consumption figure that's provided by suppliers. And these two sets of data, the subnational energy statistics and Need, are a really crucial part of an awful lot of planning and thinking that goes on across the energy sector. So the first workshop we had the ESO talking about the reliance that they place on this sort of data to get their picture of demand side activity, which underpins future energy scenarios, and hence now also the distribution networks using that same kind of basis for their distributed Phase that goes into their network planning. So a core part of network planning thinking. It feeds into Ofgem, the typical domestic consumption values, which are used to inform things like the price cap, retail price cap, again, are drawing from Need data. Committee on Climate Change and NEA and others at that first workshop all stressed the importance of having a good understanding of the demand side, that the Phase statistics were the real go-to source for that kind of information as a robust, reliable source, but that needed to kind of improve to help us understand the new challenges that we face as we go into the energy transition. So it's acknowledged out of those workshops that smart meter data will make it more accurate. So the first comment about it being estimated disappears if you've got collecting the data from through smart meter process. But that's not enough. We need more temporal granularity in the energy market today, as I think everybody on this call knows. The seasonal demands and even within day patterns of demands are becoming increasingly important. When you think about heat decarbonisation and you think about renewable energy, that temporal granularity is increasingly important. The other point that we made in that meeting was that BEIS currently collect this annualised data from suppliers using the Statistics of Trade Act 1947, and those same powers could be used to collect more data if they felt the case could be made. And the other thing that came out of that workshop was that they are anyway going to have to think about the kind of technical way that they collect the data, because with the change to half-hourly settlement, the data aggregator role disappears, and so some changes will be made, and that, in our view, is a trigger for them to think about what data they can collect and the best way to do it. So that was the first workshop, where we were very grateful to BEIS for having kind of made a very significant contribution into the thinking on that one. The second workshop, next slide, Vicky, was on regulation, where again we were very lucky to have Ofgem led us, first of all, with their views about how important data is to help them in their role, monitoring the market, assessing their interventions, evaluating impacts, and they highlighted 3 particular areas where going forwards they could see that they were going to need better data in terms of understanding the impacts of decisions on vulnerability, flexibility, energy demand side flexibility, and efficiency. And across the piece, Ofgem is building its data capability, and that goes back to this sort of fact that across the piece, energy data is becoming increasingly important, and a lot of focus there, and some quite innovative things that Ofgem are doing around hackathons to look at different ways that data can be used to kind of provide insights and understanding into areas which you may not know. You can't set out in advance exactly what you're going to learn from that data, but that they were finding from hackathons the real value in some other sources of data that they were able to get hold of. We also talked in that workshop, privileged to have a couple of, we had Jacopo Torriti as an academic, and Frontier, who'd been working on some of these issues for Ofgem, really getting into the detail about how you would look at the particular distributional impacts of policies around time of use charging, for example, where you need to be able to link granular demand side data and demographic data. And what came out of that workshop is, there are ways that people do it, but you tend to either have diary data, which Jacopo uses, which has a lot of demographic data, but doesn't actually have energy consumption data. Or you have the Low Carbon Network Fund pilots, which have very good for a sample of profiles of households, a profile of their energy consumption, but relatively limited demographic data. So actually getting those 2 bits linked together, which is one of the things that we talked about in phase 1, is something that really doesn't work well at the minute. The Cell Database does this, but even as it goes forwards, this is a database that UCL have set up, which we'll talk about a bit more about later, but that has a limited sample size and also is only open to academics. So that was one area that we explored in depth, but more generally, Simon was pushing the point that understanding emerging market issues as we move to more complex tariffs and time of use tariffs. How can Ofgem tell that suppliers are treating customers fairly without some understanding of what's happening in the market? Suppliers have that information about customers' usage patterns. Ofgem need it as well. Back to Judith's comment about otherwise they're going to be flying blind into that transition. Similarly, we talked about DNO and Ofgem's role in setting DNO price controls, and how actually as the pattern of demands change. This is no longer just about peak load. Really understanding the patterns of demand will be increasingly important to understand whether the networks are operating efficiently. And again, you're going to have an even greater information asymmetry in the price controls if Ofgem don't have better demand side data. And then finally, Ofgem are interested always in testing, ways of giving nudges and what tools and techniques could be made to get customers to take up time of use tariffs or to change behaviour, and having a better tool for doing that was something that they identified as important. Third workshop then, we moved on to local area planning, and as alluded to before, this is an increasingly important area as regions, cities, local areas think about EV infrastructure, heat planning, and Ofgem and the Energy Systems Catapult have both done quite a lot to kind of push the importance of local area energy planning as part of the network price controls. But if you're going to do that, you need better than annual estimated demand to do that. We discussed the reliance on models of energy demand to predict the impact of policy changes, but those models need to be trained on real world data, which is an opportunity for smart meter data that we come back to. As well as local area energy planning, there's just the simple task of tracking performance against climate goals. And then in terms of what other data could be used to help in this area, we talked about CERL and innovation pilots that have provided useful data in other areas, but they're definitely not providing large enough samples for the kind of local area analysis that we were discussing in that workshop. So again, another area where better data would be really valuable. Then the final workshop on heat decarbonisation, which we know is one of our next great challenge as we look to move to net zero. And one of the reasons it's a particular challenge is it requires every household to do something, to take action. It's not simply a case of being able to change the system. And if we're going to change things in individual homes, then we really need a better understanding of what and how heat is used today. And that really highlighted, as we kind of tried to trawl through what's there, the real paucity of data that's available. So if you think about the buildings themselves, we need a better modelling of the thermal efficiency of buildings. We talked about the use of smart meter data to provide smart EPCs. So actually using assessments of actual energy consumption, rather than having somebody coming in and wandering around your house for 10 minutes and saying, I think this is a C. And also similarly for looking at the impact of actually measuring the impact of different interventions. Again, better data will allow you to really understand what impact different technologies and potential energy efficiency interventions or low carbon technologies might have. But we all know as well that it's not just about the buildings. You can have two identical buildings which will have very different energy profiles and heat demand. And so it's about understanding how energy demand varies from house to house based on demographics. An awful lot down still beyond that to just customer preferences. And this takes you into the whole area of fuel poverty and really getting our heads around how those in fuel poverty may be actually using energy in a very different way, as they have to make uncomfortable choices about perhaps only heating one room in the property or whatever. That we need to understand that if we're going to make energy policy around heat decarbonisation that takes account of how people live in the real world, not just the theoretical modelling of the capability of the buildings. And as an example of kind of the lack of understanding even now, the basic split between space heating and hot water usage of your gas consumption is not well understood at all. The assumption is that it's about 20% on hot water, but that comes from a sample of just over 100 homes about 15 years ago. So it really is a very, very crude assumption, and that kind of thing is increasingly important as we try to think about the role of hot water tanks and hot water generally as part of heat decarbonisation. Similarly, as we move to electrification, how heat pumps are used in practice, not just how they are theoretically designed on the drawing board. People will use them in different ways, and we need to understand how they're used in practice to understand what impact that's going to have on their bills and on the networks themselves. So a huge amount of things that we still really don't understand on heat, and where smart meter data could help shine a light. We did find some additional data sources, but there are some gaps, big gaps, that remain on this side. So that, as I say, those 4 workshops really emphasise to us that there is a need for more data in a number of different areas, but it also helped us think about the practical steps that we could take next. So the next slide is our 6 broad recommendations, which I'm now going to talk through in turn. So next slide, the first one links into that first workshop around BEIS energy statistics to be expanded to respond to users' needs. So moving from annualized demand, we felt as an absolute minimum, BEIS ought to be collecting monthly demand, maximum demand, and export, which reflects the fact that when we use energy matters, not just how much. I think everybody felt that was ought to be a manageable task, and that even that would help and would make a huge difference. But we would encourage BEIS to have greater ambition and to think about getting half-hourly data, even if not from all households, from a sample, so that we can really have a robust data source that shows us patterns of half-hourly energy usage to inform those kind of policy areas we were talking about before. And as part of that, this is this sort of anonymised data set for research, as well as the kind of aggregated statistics, something like the need database of 4 million homes, linking with some kind of basic demographic data is also invaluable. As we've noted before, they have the powers to collect that currently, and could therefore use those same powers to collect slightly more data. But our report recommends that they also think about DNOs as an alternative source for some data if suppliers are not collecting quite the data that they need. And then the other thing that we've put in there is continuing this dialogue. One of BEIS's comments to us was that they haven't, although the workshops were very clear that more data was needed, people haven't been hammering BEIS's door down asking for more data. So I think there's a little bit of a push for us onto the users to keep hammering the BEIS door down and to make clear that this is important, because that will strengthen BEIS's elbow in getting the resources they need to be able to deliver on this agenda. So next area of recommendations is the UCL Cell Database, which is data that has been collected with consumer consent and links to a very significant amount of demographic information and a survey and so on. And Ewan will be talking a little bit more, I suspect, about where they're up to in his response. But that which was on a kind of plan at the start of PIAG 1 is now up and running. They've got 13,000 homes signed up and are beginning to work with other academics to kind of produce some of the initial analysis. So what was clear from all of our workshops was the real value that database has in combining both gas, electricity, demand data and demographic data. So we are absolutely that backing the idea that this should continue. It was a 5-year project initially, while they had to kind of prove the case, and I think that case has been proven that it can be done and it's of value. So we would support extending that beyond 2022, but there are things that need to be addressed, as you know, having kind of established it, about the size and the scope of the sample at the minute. Because of where we are on the smart meter rollout, for example, there aren't any economy 7 meters in there, and also we think it's really important that non-university researchers can access that data in the same way as they can for other data sets with UK Data Service. And if necessary, being accredited researchers, there are a whole set of arrangements that apply in other sectors. So those issues have already been worked through and can be used to allow slightly wider access than is currently available with the Cell database. That's looking ahead, but in the near term, we would encourage Cell to continue to looking at ways that they can open up that access. And in particular, we talked about the scope for them working with third parties, which they are already doing in some limited ways, but to kind of really publicise and make that opportunity a little bit more significant, including perhaps going forwards funding for those kind of exercises that would allow some joint working. So that's the Cell database. To build on that, the next area, next slide, Vicky, is the data that the DNOs themselves collect. So distribution networks can collect data without consumer consent, provided they have a privacy plan approved by Ofgem, through which the data is, as far as possible, aggregated and anonymised. And all 6 DNOs now have privacy plans approved. In the report we said 5, but since we published the report, the 6th one has now been approved. And what most of them have done, and we've produced an appendix that summarises all of those privacy plans. They're basically aggregating the data to the feeder level, which is what matters to the network, but in a number of cases also holding the monthly data by meter point, and in some cases that includes a kind of measure of maximum demand. So they've been looking at, kind of what is the best and most useful data that they can hold consistent with their privacy restrictions. Some kinds of data, maximum demand, voltage and export, are not explicitly covered by that privacy framework. So there is other data that they will be collecting as well. And the reason that the DNO network data is particularly important in the context of the workshops is when you're thinking about local area energy planning, then what matters as you're thinking about where to put your EV infrastructure is to link it to the network topology. So kind of DNO data held in this kind of structure is particularly helpful in the context of local area energy plans. And then we have the position, as I talked about, with a lot of the work that's been going on energy data more generally, network system data, the Energy Data Task Force, and out of that, the Data Best Practice Guidance has a principle about presumed open. So other network data that the DNOs held should be presumed, or all the data that networks hold should be presumed open. But the Data Best Practice Guidance allows for a triage where there are privacy issues, and that's not the case, but the guidance makes clear that you don't just say, sorry, there are privacy issues. The guidance talks about the steps that the network should take to mitigate those privacy issues, whether it's the anonymization and aggregation, but also some more sophisticated techniques that are used elsewhere. So a real sense that networks should be thinking about, for all of their data, how to make that open. And our line is quite simply that once suitably aggregated, and that may well be more aggregated than it is for their own use purposes, then once that data is sufficiently aggregated so that it's no longer would be considered private data under GDPR, then it should be treated as system data. But there are still some ambiguities and a lack of clarity around whether the data that they have collected under the terms of their privacy plans would allow them to do that. And we believe that this is an important area for Ofgem to issue some guidance and to kind of allow for the DNOs, make clear that whole framework of requirements that's there on the networks around opening up their data also applies to depersonalized data, that's even if its origins were smart meter data, once it's no longer personalized, those same license requirements should apply there as well. Next area, no, wrong direction, number 4. It's about, we talked about training models to improve the accuracy of representations of energy demand that's then used in particularly in local area energy planning, but in other ways as well. And that this is a sort of early priority for early action, using smart meter data in that way. And then in some sense, the models can be made available and the data doesn't have to be made quite so widely available. And you know, our recommendation is that Phase and UCL Cell should look at how this could be done through the data that's already there. But an important part of that also is making sure that where you have consumer or publicly funded pilots, for example, the big heat pump trial that's going on at the minute was not actually collecting energy consumption data as a part of it. So anything that is being funded in future where we've got major pilots, that smart meter data should be collected in as a part of that exercise, and then that data can then be used to improve the models. Next one, gas demand. This comes particularly out of workshop 4, where I was talking about the real paucity of data around heat. You know, gas in some sense has always been the poor relation. Electricity is where we started doing our thinking. We really need now to have a major push on getting better gas demand data so that we understand at a household level how gas is being used. There's some significant steps that could be taken there. At the minute, gas distribution networks don't collect any data. They don't have to be part of smart DCC. And you know, one of our recommendations is that Ofgem Phase should revisit the case for GDNs to participate in smart DCC and to be funded to do that as part of their price control. One of the reasons GDNs, you know, they have flagged, you know, the significant costs in doing that. And that actually prompted us to start thinking, well, perhaps actually the DNOs who are already part of smart DCC, could they collect the gas data? You know, increasingly they're going to be thinking about the impacts of heat electrification and planning for that. Understanding gas demand may well be useful to them in that context, but that's not currently permitted under the data access and privacy framework, which only allows the electricity networks to collect electricity data. And perhaps again that might need a bit of a rethink. So that's trying to get kind of wholesale step change in the amount of gas demand data that's out there, which I think is really needed if we're going to seriously move to refit 30 million homes with either electric heating or hydrogen or district heating. We really need to understand where we're starting from. But in the meantime, you know, there were bits of data that we unearthed that could be of value and just need to have a little bit more of a light shone on them. So we talked about the fact that actually one of the major sources that have been used for a lot of policy thinking on electricity was from the innovation projects that had been carried out there. And in contrast, on the gas side, where they've done major innovation projects and have collected gas consumption data, that has not been made publicly available because of concerns about privacy. And so our view is that Ofgem need to provide guidance to the gas distribution networks on how to make that data publicly available, as happened on electricity. And you know, on electricity, it took a bit of a push by Ofgem to get that published, but it's been an invaluable source, and we would ask Ofgem to do the same on gas. We also identified that ExoServe holds profile data that gives a picture of gas demand across the year and through the day, linked to weather. On electricity, that kind of profile data is publicly available. On ExoServe. In the gas sector, it isn't, and again, that in our view would be a relatively easy thing to fix. UCL Cell, as I've commented before, does collect gas data, and I'm not saying prioritise research above electricity, there's plenty of issues there as well, but some of the ways that they're going to be looking to produce an annual report and so on could provide at least some basic statistics that otherwise are missing in the gas sector. We also floated about sharing insights by players in the competitive markets. So, where very much boiler manufacturers in some cases are collecting information about heat demand and energy usage. Clearly, the suppliers and those who are thinking about their role in heat pumps, providing heat pumps and participating in that wider debate about public policy, could provide at least some insights that they get from the data that they hold, even if that the basic data itself is clearly maybe considered commercially sensitive. There is opportunities for public-spirited players to do more sharing data in that space, or even for somebody like Phase to formally request that data. And then finally, bringing all those bits together, as I say, we did find other odd little academic studies and other sources of data that could be useful in putting together a bit of a jigsaw picture from the data that's currently available. And one of our recommendations, therefore, is that Phase should commission a meta study to try to bring all of that together. And then finally, sixth recommendation is about looking to the longer term. So if all of those things we're trying to do the best that we can in short order with data that's kind of there and just needs to be made more publicly available, we had set out in phase one more of a picture about a long-term role with a kind of a data hub and a trusted data processor that could bring together a full data set of statistics and an anonymized data set for research. And our recommendations are that these options are kept open for how one could provide longer term a comprehensive solution. That means Ofgem and Phase continuing to reflect on the importance of them having this data, and thinking as they make changes to the wider energy system, whether it's half-hourly settlement target operating model or DCC license renewal, what those opportunities might be for getting a better public interest access to data. The creation of an independent system operator also provides another opportunity that could be thought about, both to be clear about their needs. Currently, the ESO does not have the right to access demand-side data from smart meters. It feels like that's something that should change if you were creating a new independent system operator, but also that they could play a potential facilitating role, looking across DNOs who at the minute do things in a slightly different way, which hampers getting a national picture, but an ISO could potentially help in that. We recognise that the data access and privacy framework, which actually I worked on in its very early days, was written a long time ago, before smart meters were really being rolled out in earnest. And we know how much the whole data agenda and everything else has changed. So it feels, together with the fact that we now understand for the networks how they might use the data, which at the beginning of the process was not clear. So it does seem that the time is right for a fuller review of the data access and privacy framework. We've also seen a lot of activity by those central parties, Elexon, Electrolink, TCC, thinking about how they can make better use of the metadata that they have access to, which is something that we really welcomed coming out of PIAG 1, and would like to see them continuing to focus on that. with that being perhaps more of a short-term thing, but again, those central bodies have a potential role to play in a comprehensive solution. And one of the reasons that this needs to stay on the agenda is, as the landscape shifts and everybody's roles change, those opportunities can become greater for different players to play a more substantive role in providing that access to the data for a public interest purpose. So those were our 6 recommendations. And our final slide is really just a reminder that we are now at the end of the process. We are, with this webinar, drawing PIAG to a close. And so we are very much dependent on the colleagues on the call today and those to whom we address the recommendations to keep the PIAG flame alive and to really make sure that those recommendations are taken forward. Clearly, those of us like Judith, Simon and I aren't going to leave the energy space, so we probably will be kind of waving the flag from time to time, but there isn't going to be a sort of serious programme of work. But we really hope that there are synergies with the Modernising Energy Data Digitalisation programme, and we hope that through that programme many of these recommendations can also be picked up. So that is covers all of the ground through the workshops and our recommendations, and I'm handing back now to Simon to kind of get responses from those who were involved. Thank you, Simon.